L'Algérie, colonie puis département français depuis 1830, va enfin accéder à l'indépendance.
Today, an award-winning film that sheds light on a largely silenced yet essential part of Algerian-French colonial history. French-Algerian journalist Dorothée Myriam Kellou, who made In Mansourah You Separated Us, joins us to talk about this deeply moving documentary in which she takes her father, Malik, back to his village in Algeria, a village he fled as a 10-year-old in 1960. It was during the Algerian War of Independence, and until the film, he had never returned. Dorothée, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this week marks 60 years since the signing of the Evian Agreements, which ended the war in Algeria and more than 130 years of French colonisation. It's an extremely painful and sensitive subject to talk about here in France. Now, Dorothée, your father is Algerian. For years, your questions about his past, about the past, were faced with silence. Did this filmmaking journey help you understand why there is so much taboo about this conflict?
Yeah, very much so. I think growing up in France, in a family, my mother is French, my father is Algerian, I had questions about why my father had not passed on his language to me, his memories. So very early on, I started learning Arabic and reading about the history. And thanks to a master's degree in the US at Georgetown University, I was able to get a grant and go research in Algeria. And I took my father with me 50 years after, and it became a film. And today I understand better why all this silence. First of all, the suffering and the trauma of the war, and also, I would say, the lack of spaces to share these very difficult and painful stories. And I think I made a film also to create this space for my father to share and other inhabitants of the village to share.
And describe what it was like going back to his village, a village he hadn't been in for more than half a century.
It was very moving. Actually, these images we're seeing on screen are the first images I shot when I went back there. I mean, I went and he went back 50 years after. And it was just like a small camera, and I wanted to record, you know, every emotion. And I think I was extremely moved, just, you know, understanding where my actually ancestor came from and what they went through. And my father was a bit shy in showing his emotion. And it took me years actually to be able to have access to his most intimate memories. And that's the film, actually.
Well, during the Algerian War of Independence, your father's village was one of thousands of communities the colonial French rulers turned into resettlement camps. These forced removals affected nearly half of the rural Algerian population, and at the end of the war, more than 2 million people were dispersed between 2,000 recruitment camps created by the French army. Now, the film unravels your father's story, but also the memories of those displaced to Mansourah, as well as the inhabitants who saw their village turn into a camp they could not escape from. We can hear it from one of the villagers you spoke to in the film.
ودورنا الشباك على الدشره هذه الطمايه الدشره هي ثوريه داروا لنا جوج بيبان كما كانوا هذو الجماعه درك داروا لنا باب المقبره وباب منه الكوفور على السته في ذاك الوقت ما تدخل لا نعجه ولا بقره ولا يحكموك على الاخر يطرقوك جابوا المحابسيه جزائريين يديروا في الشباك هذاك باللي قلت انا شويه كاسيه يدوروا لنا في شباك فيه واحد 4 مترات وهم كاع عالمين بولات منصوره كاع واش حاضر المال اي حاجه ما خلوش.
Now, Dorothée, despite its scale and the consequences that resettlement had on millions of lives, the historical phenomenon remains largely absent from the collective memory in both France and Algeria. Why is it important to share these experiences?
I think because, you know, not passing on your memories is actually creating a lot of uneasiness in my generation. in the generation that hasn't experienced the war, a lot of question, and sometimes we actually recreating fantasies. Where do we come from? And I think that knowing that, you know, maybe our parents or grandparents were displaced from this area, and understanding the process emotionally that they went through, make us really understand better their actual state. I was always, you know, wondering why my father was so melancholic sometimes, you know, as a child, facing his silence and strong emotion. I couldn't put words on them. And I think like making this film, it was very appeasing for me. And when I'm sharing these stories with like others, they are also releasing a lot of emotion and feeling more at peace.
Well, one man in the film recalls his family being loaded into a truck and driven off. Another shows his scars from bullet wounds and talks about being troubled by the men he killed. Your father talks about ongoing nightmares. We hear from one of the few survivors as well, who was with a group of Algerian freedom fighters who the government bombed with napalm.
الواحد إلا تقاس في كرعيه والله في عينيه ما عندوش هذا هو ممكن وكان مثل ما موش تقص في عينيه ممكن نمنع القش نتاعي وكل مخرج يعني لو يعني كان الإنسان يعني يدري باش يوصل كيما اليوم هكذايا ترى القش هذاك نخبيه باش يعني ياخذوا العبرة يعني كيفاش.
It looks like a very emotional moment, was it?
It was, yeah.
Was it difficult to do those interviews?
I think I was very, you know, eager to hear their stories and their emotions. So sometimes they would share their stories in a very quick way. And I could feel that they were suppressing their emotion. So I will do the interview again and be like, take your time. And sometimes they broke into tears, you know, and it was very moving because they are old men, you know, you're not expecting them to be, you know, so affected 60 years after by what happened. It was a very moving journey indeed.
Well, Dorothée, you belong to the new generation who are revealing the stories of the Algerian War. We've got a special report now with two artists who've been reflecting on one of the darkest pages of France's colonial history. In October 1961, around 30,000 Algerians took to the streets of Paris in a peaceful protest against the curfew. That day is now known as the Paris Massacre of 1961. It's estimated 200 people were killed by the police, some thrown into the River Seine. Renaud Lefort and Emerald Maxwell have this.
Sur cette plaque, c'est écrit à la mémoire des nombreux Algériens tués lors de la sanglante répression de la manifestation pacifique du 17 octobre 1961.
The bloody police crackdown haunts two generations of the same family.
On ne sera jamais en paix après tout ça. Et je ne parle pas de nos deux Younes, je parle de tout le monde.
In this play by French-Romanian Alexandra Badea, the past mixes with the present.
I became French in 2014. We were told, from now on you have to own the history of this country, with its moments of glory and its darker sides. What I wanted to do was talk about a wound that becomes apparent 2 generations later, because I think nowadays in French society we are being confronted with these wounds.
The same wounds are also the starting point for the Seine's tears. Yanis Belaïd was inspired by his grandfather's account of that day in October 1961.
Une manifestation de musulmans d'Algérie a été réprimée avec une incroyable violence par les forces de l'ordre.
Voilà, ils ont chargé, et puis c'est la peur, ils ont tiré et eux les autres foutaient le camp.
When he speaks to me about it, it's always with great sadness. The wound hasn't healed. Then when he saw the film, he was very proud. Learning to live together in peace is the fundamental point of the project. And that was instilled in me by my grandfather. Hatred is useless.
Yanis wanted to overcome this hatred through the gentle notes of trumpeter Ibrahim Maalouf.
The Seine's Tears is a short film that moved me a lot. And I really like the scene of the demonstration that becomes a dance. We don't really know where they are. It's like a concert with the police pointing their guns at them. It feels like a dream.
While recognizing the wounds of the past in both his and Alexandra's work, Yanis is optimistic for France's future.
What I like about Alexandra Badia's work is how she approaches the theme of the duty to remember. There's this character who is searching for her origins, but along the way she also finds the history of France, and we see this couple who cannot love each other because of their origins. I hope that this would no longer be the case today.
With a past that doesn't always pass, the poetry of these two works offers a different look at a sad chapter in French history.
Now, Dorothée, it was only last year that the massacre of 1961 was acknowledged by a French president. France is ever so slowly reconciling itself with this ugly part of its history. What more needs to be done, do you think?
I think, like you were talking about the new generation, and we're very much struggling to make our artwork and researches, and we, I think, need a lot of financial support. I mean, it took me 8 years to, convince founders in France to invest in my work and create this film. And I think it's way too much, like, too many efforts. And I think we have now to share more all this means to make things happen and change what we're going through today, which is a lot of racism and political difficulties, I think.
Okay, Dorothée, your film is in Mansourah. You separated us. You're also working on a book about the subject. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you. Now we're going to play out with images from an exhibition called Algérie, mon amour, or Algeria, my love, celebrating Algerian artists at Paris's Arab World Institute. It's on until July. Remember our website. We're also on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.
On March 18, 1962, France and Algeria signed a ceasefire agreement. While opening the way to a declaration of independence, this date in no way marked an end to the violence.
Quand les accords ont été signés, il y a un déferlement de violence inouïe en Algérie.
The anti-independence OAS stepped up its bombings and assassinations, while the nationalist FLN responded with murders and kidnappings. Hundreds of thousands of French colonials, or pieds noirs, fled the country, whilst the French army left the pro-French Muslims, or Harkis, to their fate.
Tout cela, c'était un projet magnifique qui aurait pu entrer en vigueur dans les années 40, 50, peut-être 60. Mais ça a été gâché par, en effet, des hésitations, des reculs, des crimes des deux côtés.
Our reporters went to meet those who witnessed and took part in this crucial period in the history of the two countries. Don't miss Evian 1962, the end of the Algerian War, on France 24 and France24.com.